And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we are gathered here virtually to discuss the influence of RSS on Indian politics and society internally, and also its reflection on Indian foreign affairs. The Hindutva ideology that is propagated by the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, and how it is influencing India internally and its external affairs with its neighbors. People usually talk about the influence of RSS on Indian state and society, but usually the specifics of its influence on Indian state and society are not usually very well understood. For example, how well is RSS plugged into the politics of BJP? And how long has RSS been associated with Jana Sangh? And what is the dynamic between RSS and the BJP of today? So some scholarship has recently emerged on these critical subjects. One of these is this book produced by, written by A.G. Noorani in 2020. It is RSS, the RSS, A Menace to India. It's works like these which shed some light on what's going on in India with regard to Hindutva politics and its influence on the Indian state and society. And that's why we have gathered an eminent panel of speakers to talk about these subjects. So first, our three speakers for today are Dr. Salma Malik, Dr. ILHAN NIAZ, and Dr. ASMA SHAKIR KHAWAJA. The first speaker that I would invite to speak on this important subject today is Dr. ASMA SHAKIR KHAWAJA, who is an associate professor and head of the Department of Strategic Studies at the National Defense University, Islamabad, where she has been a faculty member since 2008. She is the author of Shaking Hands with Clenched Fists, the Grand Trunk Road to Confidence Building Measures between Pakistan and India, which was published in 2020 by the National Defense University. Dr. Khwaja has done her PhD in South Asian Studies from the Institute of South Asian Studies, Martin Luther University, Halle-Wittenberg, Germany. With that introduction, I invite you to give your initial 10 to 15 minutes remarks on the subject. Over to you, Dr. ASMA SHAKIR KHWAJA.
Am I audible? Assalamu alaikum.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Arish, for giving us this opportunity to talk about this important issue. And I wish that Indians would be conducting more thought-provoking sessions on this issue, because this is the thing which is damaging their internal cohesion and international reputation as well. So first of all, yes, RSS is an organization which is manifesting the ideology of Hindutva for several decades, even well before the creation of Pakistan. One thing I always say, that if the mindset of Hindutva was never there, then Muhammad Ali Jinnah would never leave Congress and join Muslim League, because he felt like he's not audible or neither visible in Congress in the presence of Hindus, and nor his comments or viewpoint is respected. So ideology of Hindutva was always there, and that is why we thought that we cannot live Hindu in a Hindu majority state. And that is why we thought that we need a separate homeland called Pakistan. So first of all, we should be clear that Hindutva is not a new phenomena. It was there. It was there when the Hindu religion was emerging almost 3,000 years before Christ. Hindutva is the political resurgence of Hindu nationalism and constitutes a potential ideological politics of supremacy through maximization and manifestation of power. So in the nutshell, that is what Hindutva is all about. Hindu nationalism, maximization of power, and manifestation of that power as well. Then Hindutva talks about hard and soft, both aspects of security. Hard security means that your physical capability to coerce others and to compel others to fulfill your will, or to compel others not to do something as per their own will. And then the soft aspect of security is ideology. It also disseminates the ideology that only Hindus have this right to live in South Asia because that region belongs to only Hindu religion, and all other religion which were as per them imported from outside, just such as Islam and Christianity, the people belonging to those religions should be kicked out of the South Asia. And then another aspect of soft security is uh, technological advancement and all those things which they want to acquire only to coerce others, not to help the society, not to help the development and progress of their own society, but with the intention to coerce others. And then right now in India, Hindutva is manifested in high and low politics. High politics traditionally is considered as the military and your armed forces, and low politics is the politician and governance and all those people. So we can see there is a chain reaction in all institutions of India, whether it was their armed forces, or it is their Supreme Court, or it is their parliament, or it is their politicians, governance, police, everywhere. This Hindutva is the dominating ideology. Moreover, when it comes to region, Hindutva explains the nature of Pakistan and India's bilateral relations. Hindutva is the framework under which Modi regime, BJP, and other, I would say, other Indian governments also manufactured their Pakistan's policy, developed their policies towards Pakistan and other countries of the region. And if you remember, I just said that Hindutva is the policy of supremacy. It believes in supremacy of Hindu ideology only, and that that delusional ideas of supremacy also explain that Indian governments since day one are unable to respect the regional the sovereignty of regional states, and rather they worked on promoting the hegemony of Indian state, which is unfortunately the largest state of South Asia as well. So they very well manifested that supremacy as well. Moreover, if you ask me that how, in terms of anthropology, what Hindutva symbolizes, Hindutva symbolizes white supremacy, and it constructs exclusive society through religious, political, and social polarization. What is this white supremacy? White supremacy, the idea revolves around that when the Aryans invaded South Asia almost 3,000 years before Christ, and this, we call it Aryan migration and they call it Aryan invasion. So whatever, when the region, because South Asia is a melting pot of different civilizations and ethnic groups, even 3 to 5,000 years before Christ. So those who brought this Hindu religion were white Aryans, blonde Aryans, and that is the whole idea of Hindutva, is the supremacy of Brahman, that is Brahmanization of their culture and their thought process as well. The most chronic or most dangerous region right now for the peace and security of South Asia is Kashmir, the disputed land of Indian occupied Kashmir, and which is the only Muslim state occupied by the colonial India. And it symbolizes the Indian and Aryan colonization, and practically manifests that Hindus or Indian Hindutva would rule even the regions which are Muslim majority, which is a Muslim majority state. And then it is the Himalaya as well, which has very, Kashmir is situated in Himalaya, which is very sacred place in Indian Vedas, Hindu Vedas and Hindu ideology. Hindutva believes that Aryans, because there is a very important book written by an Indian author, Hindu author, was Aryan Samaj, and there was a movement as well of Aryan Samaj. So they believe that Aryans were superior people who came from Central Asia, conquered the northern India, which is now at the western India, and established the vast Aryan civilization. And that encourages the power of centralization, because Aryans manifested their power in hard and soft both forms of security. They developed the religion Hinduism, and they conquered by force and by coercion already existing civilizations of South Asia. Rather, they not only conquered, but they destroyed those civilizations as well. Hindutva believes in Akhand Bharat. They believe that its whole South Asia should be one Hindu state. And this reminds me a reading. I was reading somewhere that I think Shashi Tharoor wrote it, if I'm not wrong, uh, that the Hindutva proponents should be thankful to Muslims, because Muslims were the first community which established South Asia as one state. Prior to that, South Asia was divided into different kingdoms, and there is not one single Hindu state in the entire history of South Asia which was like South Asia ruled by a Hindu king as a whole. There were small states of Hindu kings, but South Asia was never been a one state. Uh, interestingly, this Hindutva, not only they believe that South Asia should be one state, but they also believe that there would be a Kurukshetra, the sacred war against the imported religions, mainly Muslims or Islam, and that we would be very sacred war, and that would decide the fate of South Asia, and South Asia would become a one collective large Hindu state. So they not only they suggest this idea of Akhand Bharat, but they also provide the framework to achieve it, which is through a sacred war as per their ideas. Hindutva ideology, how it is serving Indian nation, what it is bringing for Indians. That is very important to understand. It is a complex approach which employs short-term tactics mainly for domestic consumption. Right now, if as an observer or third party I view the whole situation, to me Hindutva is a political slogan just to divert public's attention from the real issues, such as economy, such as progress, such as peace and security, and employment, like so many real issues. So it is a political strength to divert public's attention from the real issue, and it has created for India, for Hindus, it has created a perception that peace is a zero-sum game. So when something is a zero-sum game, nations under rational choice theory, they don't opt for it. So peace is not something to be achieved, rather than, unfortunately, in reality, war in a nuclear region would be a zero-sum game. In a region with two nuclear powers and surrounded by so many other nuclear powers, the war would be a zero-sum game. Peace would never be, cannot be a zero-sum game. But unfortunately, this is what Hindutva has inculcated in the mindset of Hindu voters. Lack of communication, false understandings, and hyper-nationalism create helpful environment for Hindutva to employ ideology, capital politics, real politics, and geopolitics to manipulative purposes. So these are these ingredients provided the fertile ground to Hindutva proponents. Highlights of Hindutva, highlights of the ideology. The behavior of a state is defined through identity, and why Hindutva became so important in Indian political fabric and overall governance fabric. and social fabric as well. So the behavior of a state is defined through identities and interests, structured by norms, values, rules, and institutions within that state. Hindutva emerges, or the concept of Hindutva accelerated due to the drivers of mistrust. Their drivers of mistrust are deep rooted into history, and they are Hindus versus other religion or ethnic communities of South Asia. Uh, Constructivists argue that state identities and interests are constructed through prevailing culture and norms, but state has no fixed interest. So this is how India realign and reprioritize the interests of Indians in state of India. State-oriented threats are due to its own vulnerabilities, and security threats can be reduced by reducing social vulnerabilities. That is what Hindutva ideology does not capitalize upon. Hindutva ideology, in order to divert public's attention, totally forget this idea that external vulnerabilities can be reduced through reducing social vulnerabilities within us, within the borders of a state. Right now, because of this market of Hindutva ideology, because of this Hindutva ideology is a political dividend. It brings votes, it attracts voters, and it is an election winning strategy. So that is why, as the result of inculcating this ideology in Indian public, no political will and political capital for peaceful coexistence with Pakistan or other neighbors if they don't listen to the Indian leaders. Only if they other South Asian states, if they become puppets in the hands of Indian leaders, Indian leadership, and act upon to serve the interests of Indian state, only then they can peacefully coexist with India. Otherwise, there is no chance of peaceful coexistence. As I said earlier, Hindutva among Indian public has reduced the appetite for peace. Now, peace is not something which Indian people they dream for. In reality, it is the Kurukshetra or war or aggressive posturing or teaching enemy a lesson. This is what is being propagated, or but what is being taught to the Indian public. Then Hindutva supports competitive security calculus. All other regions of the world, like ASEAN, like SCO, they are progressing because they converted the competition-based security framework to the cooperation-based security. Security is something that it is not important to be in a competition with each other to achieve that security or perception of security. Sometimes cooperation is more fruitful than the competition. But Hindutva ideology has strengthened the competitive security calculus in South Asia, and Indian public believe that they can achieve security only by downgrading other or being superior from the rest in terms of military and technology. All these things, or all these learning outcomes of Hindutva, they have created a perceptional paradox for Indian public. Indian public has a delusional perception of self and irrational perception of others, because we all are humans. So no one is neither a devil or a prophet, but they have this perceptional, delusional idea that of them as the superior most and the most competent nation, and others are inferior to them. This perceptional paradox and the politics of hatred and superiority, that leads to the dilemma of interpretation, because in the presence of that perceptual paradox, they are Indian public and Indian decision makers are unable to rationally interpret the actions and words and statements and the events in the region or outside the region. So this puts them in a dilemma of interpretation, which leads to the dilemma of response. Like if they are in perceptional paradox and wrongly interpreting the actions of others, then they would eventually take the wrong decisions which are mainly based on their own mindset, not on what does exist in the structure or security structure of the region. And this becomes very, very important when this, again, I'm repeating myself, when South Asia is a nuclear region. South Asia is, it is very important that the states of South Asia have rational decision-making processes. It is very important that they have this capability to rightly and accurately interpret the actions of their of others. It is very important that, as Sanju said, that they know themselves and their enemies in the correct possible ways. They should not undermine their enemies, and they should not overestimate their enemies and themselves as well. So when Modi or BJP leadership, they say कत्ल की रात and nuclear weapons जो है हमने दिवाली पे चलाने के लिए नहीं रखे, so this exactly explains that they believe that war would only destruct Pakistan. Somehow, from their idea and their ideology, it is missing that war would be equally dangerous for India. War would be a zero-sum game. And in case of a nuclear war, no one would be alive to celebrate the victory. Somehow, this aspect is completely washed away from their thought process. But it is very dangerous for the peace and security of South Asia. Then their military, unfortunately, since 2014 especially, but it was there before that as well, that their military leadership is posturing for their military posturing is for public consumption. Their aggressive stance is to appease the radical Hindutva vote bank. It is not for military purposes, but this aggressive posturing is to appease the vote bank, and that resulted in the erosion of pro-peace political leadership in India. You can see anyone, and this manifests that how intensely the ideology of Hindutva is being adopted at all levels of society in India. That there are no peace voices, there are no sane voices, I would say. Peace voices, they don't have any political constituency. Peace voices are equal to traitor in India right now. Whosoever talks about peaceful coexistence, secular India, they are not as patriot as the radical Hindu. Radicalism is one of the indicators of patriotism in India right now, which is really, really dangerous for them. I was reading an article that India imploding from within. I wish that Indian public realizes this. Hindutva is a threat to international peace, especially when South Asia cannot afford the luxury of political indecisiveness. Hindutva believes in right now as I said, that they believe that peace is a zero-sum game. So all the lingering conflicts in South Asia, they are waiting for the time when Indian government realized that they need to talk them out, they need to resolve them through negotiations, and they need to move forward on the path of peace and progress and economic development for the larger interest of billions of people living in South Asia. Then, interestingly, Hindutva has two faces as well. For the international audience, they represent themselves as yogis and yoga masters and peaceful Buddhism. Like they misuse they use the name of Buddhism, which they should not actually. But all this, the color orange, and they have these soft images. And then for internal public, they have this hate, they are hate mongers. They use derogatory comments against other ethnicities, other communities, other religions, and they are very, very aggressive posturing for domestic vote bank. So this is again a dangerous point. And unfortunately, Pakistan factor and Kashmir factor is a political dividend in India, and they get vote कि हम पाकिस्तान को सबक सिखा देंगे और हम कश्मीरियों को सबक सिखा देंगे and all those things. Mainly, if we analyze Hindutva, it's a parochial approach, and if we see one of the consequences of Hindutva is that it multiplies the security anxieties of the USA, resulting in more proactive role of USA in the region, and India acquiring more strategic position in US region in the regional ambitions of the USA. So the emerging gap between reality and pro-election promises of Modi is alarming for region, because historical trends suggest that a weak government under pressure at home over domestic issues is likely to seek popularity through aggressive adventures. And this
Asma,
is,
may I request you to kindly wind up?
yes, I'm winding up. And this is what Hindutva provides the ideal fertile ground for that. But so in a nutshell, I can say that Hindutva has made conflict cheaper than peace for India, and that is why they have those policies which are instigating, accelerating, developing conflicts with other regions rather than mitigating and resolving them. One last sentence, that religious nationalism led to the creation of Hindustan and Pakistan in 1947. And it is the time for Indian public and Indian leadership to realize that if religious nationalism led to the creation of two states in 1947, it would have the similar outcome in 2022 or onwards as well. So it is their job to realize it, not ours. Thank you so much, Arish, and I apologize for taking more time than granted. Thank you so much. Hello, am I audible?
Oh, sorry, I hadn't turned my mic on. Thank you so much for your remarks. You've painted a very grim and scary picture for all of us. I have a few questions on that for you. But before I ask my questions, I would like to know whether the other two speakers also agree with you on all these pessimistic views about the future of India. So with that, I would now like to invite our second speaker for today's session, Dr. Salma Malik, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies at the Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. She holds a PhD in Defense and Strategic Studies from Quaid-e-Azam University, besides fellowships and certifications from abroad, and specializes in areas of conflict and security studies and South Asian affairs. She is an alumnus of Uppsala University, Sweden, the Asia Pacific Center for Strategic Studies, Hawaii, a visiting research fellow at the Sandia National Labs. Besides being a member of IISS London, she is part of various forums such as Regional Center for Strategic Studies, Consortium of South Asian Think Tanks, Social Sciences Research Council, WISCOM, and WTN USA. With that introduction, I would invite Dr. Salma Malik to give her 15 minutes remarks in the session.
Thank you so much, Arisa. I'm extremely grateful and my deepest apologies. I'm not a good timekeeper, so I overrode the webinar's time. And it is has already said so much that we can actually say that we totally agree with whatever Asma has said and uh, reinstated. However, for but this is a topic that one can talk about as much as possible and still be less exhaustive about it. I would tend to look at this aspect from the aspect of strategic culture, more so because Asma has given a very broad and a very refined overview of what and how damaging this overhang of Hindutva has on, or the RCSS imprint has on India, as well as bilateral relations and the regional relations. But just for preamble, I would actually refer to this particular book that was written by Shamsul Islam, who is a secular Congress leader and a thinker in old times of India, when India had this capacity to allow as much free speech and free space as possible. And that is a tragedy that is shrinking with time. And for the moment, India is going through, it is living that moment where this transition is taking place. And many of our secular-minded civil society colleagues, whenever we talk to them, don't really realize that this is that transformational phase where the oxygen or the capacity to have an inclusive culture and an inclusive life system is slowly shrinking, because they are living in that particular moment, so they don't really realize it. But several years down the lane, this particular space that is accorded today, or that is shrinking drastically today, is not going to be there at all. And that is when there would be this moment of reckoning that India has, from within, that India has actually changed. I would look at this aspect when we look at India's transformation in terms of RSS and how this particular notion has taken hold of India. RSS to BJP, what Islam says, was Gandhi to Nehru. So we cannot actually say that RSS or BJP are two different things. BJP is perhaps the point of origin of BJP might be a little different from RSS for the sake of academic argument, but at the end of the day, today where they stand, they are hand in glove. And if we at one point would think that some people from BJP were not so ridiculed, they were not so saffronized, then today, for the sake of popular consent and market and for legitimacy, even the most secular minded, or sorry, I would say actually even the most neutral of the BJP leadership has to really toe the line of the Saffron Brigade to technically feel legitimized, to be accepted not only within the party cadres, but also with the people, and also transformed and changed what India is actually going through, or what Indian politics are going through. For disclaimer, before I come to my actual point, just a couple of things about why looking at India's domestic politics is very important at a regional level, especially for India-Pakistan binary, is that anything that is happening in India has a very direct impact on what is happening, what happens in Pakistan. Pakistan, unfortunately, also in the 1980s underwent a wave of extremism and polarized politics, which has to date returned to haunt Pakistan. And as much as we try to correct the course of history, we do feel that this overhang remains there. And just imagine the size of Pakistan in terms of physical size, as well as in terms of the population, and the size of India. And when some type of a transformation, such transformation happens in India, what type of an impact would not only the region but extra regional powers have on India? Now, another thing that one needs to, for the disclaimer, point out here is that for this time frame where not only there is a domestic consumption and a domestic appetite for RSS or saffron politics, because half of the Indian population, the civil society, still feels that they have the vigor in them to withstand and to resist this type of saffronization or suffocation that is coming to them, which is actually a fallacy. Half of them are enjoying the moment because they feel that there is this moment of recognition. There is this moment of now it is that Indian moment to enjoy. So they're going through all those internal transformations. But at the same time, India also finds an enabling international environment, which is providing this appetite for, or the satiation for ultranationalism. And we find this wave everywhere in the world. So these become complementary trends, which is supporting whatever is happening. And a lot of times when we are asked such a question as to why no one says anything about this RSS overshadow or overhang on India, the very simple explanation is that ultranationalism is the wave to reckon at the moment at the international, the global arena. So they have the luxury to enjoy and ride this wave as well. Now, why RSS is alarming for us? RSS becomes alarming because what we find is that it is actually hurting the democratic secular polity of India, and it indulges strongly into minority bashing. Now, another counter argument could be that Muslims of India do not consider themselves as a minority, but they are the second highest population group. But when you go through the Sarsang Chalaks or the supreme leaders' conversations and the writings, such as those of Sudarshan or Galwakar or any of those Savarkar and every of these people that were the forerunners of RSS and BJP and such extremist mindset, what we find is that for them, anything other than what the saffron color brought forth was a minority and needed to be assimilated, because unless and until this would happen, there was no space for these people. And there's this fascist tendency that this saffron mindset brings with it, in which all of these founding fathers of Saffron Brigade technically found a lot of ideological connection as well as ideological bearing from the fascist as well as Nazi sentiment and mindset. And they really truly appreciated Hitler for the program that Hitler had done. So that race pride, which Kawalkar talked about, that came from the Nazi culture of cultural nationalism, is something that the RSS is very proud of. And that is something which is reflective not only now, but it is something that has happened from decades, even prior to the creation of the State of India. Now, if we look at the creation of the State of India, very fascinatingly, the RSS brigade never really truly supported the creation of the State of India. They do not agree with the tricolor, the Taranga, the flag that India hosts. So the point that Asma was talking about just a while back, the marketing gimmicks and the strategy, the popular sentiment that they are stroking, they are a very, very smart market strategist when it comes to that, because they're using all of these cultural iconography to justify what they're doing. But at the same time, it is also part of the human mindset that when you find that there is someone who's trying to stroke pride in your sense of being, that gives you this feeling that, okay, we are there, we have arrived, and we are going to make the mark. So the very fact is that we need to figure out that when it comes to this question of race pride, this question of Nazi cultural nationalism, Gawalkar actually at one point mentioned in one of his writings that how well nigh impossible it is for races and cultures having differences going to root to be assimilated into one united whole. a good lesson for us in Hindustan to learn and profit with. When Hitler's Holocaust was undertaking, and it was it was going on in Germany, so he never really had space for the Muslims and all. Now, coming to my premise that I wanted to say as to why I want to look at it from the strategic culture aspect. What is strategic culture? It is technically derived from history, geography, political culture of a place. It represents the attitudes, the behaviors, the influential voices, the political elite, military establishment, as well as public opinion. This is a definition that Ken Booth brought forward. So if we actually rip apart each and every word of this definition, if we look at the history, there is a conscientious rewriting of Indian history. All of those icons, the architecture, the scriptures, the textbook, the curriculum that India had as part of its democratic secular polity, which was very craftfully maintained. And here I would also say one thing that although this doesn't really gel into this particular conversation, but if any one of us have this misnomer or this wrong feeling that RSS or the BJP is anti-Pakistan and the Congress was pro-Pakistan, then we need to have some course correction. It is pure national interest that either of these political actors are pursuing or have pursued. But having done that, what we here find is that the RSS is far more visionary and very acute in what it wants to undertake. The Congress was more nuanced. They had to look at the secular political dynamics and that's how they worked. But the way since the 1990s, the late 1990s, the first stint of BJP in government, which is a very mild version of what is happening in India today, we find that this rewriting of history, the rewriting of the narrative has become very strong. Geography. When we look at geography, we find that India, as of the early 2000s, rewrote the cartography. They tried to reattempt the cartography where the map of India is not exactly how the international cartographics look at the map of India. Rather, the map of India goes all the way up to Afghanistan. It goes all the way, it simulates Pakistan. It has a lot of other way of looking at the geography. And mind you, if we look at what is happening within India, you cannot have another map of India to be displayed within the geographical limits of India other than what the BJP or the Modi government has signified officially as of 2019. If you do that, you are liable to be imprisoned and fined heavily. The political culture has changed, it is changing, and a lot of that has to do with the attitudes and the behavior patterns of the influential voices, of the political elite, of the common people. This love jihad and rewriting of so many things, demonizing the minorities, specifically the Muslims, is all part of that because it looks good. It sounds good to the ears. So they want to actually go for that. What do they want to achieve out of this? What they technically want to achieve out of this is that they just want all the minorities that you need to actually assimilate with this one ideology, one leader, one flag, lighting the flame of Hindutva in each and every corner of this great land. Unless and until you're part of this overall sentiment, then you have no space to exist in this particular area called Bharat or Mahabharat, however you would like to narrate it. So the historical narratives and everything is changing. And that changes the strategic doctrine of the country. And as the strategic doctrine of the country changes, so does India's mindset, so does India's way of looking at how it wants to situate itself in the world politics. And that is in a very aggressive fashion. That is in a very not only hegemonic fashion, something that we had always talked about because Pakistan felt the heat of India's hegemonic designs, but it is also a very assertive and expansionist fashion. And here one needs to also differentiate that there was a nation state, Nepal, which was a Hindu nation state by terms of religion, which is now turning secular in a very interesting fashion. But here was this huge country that took the appeal of secularism because secularism suited them in the post-colonial narrative, where they had to differentiate that Pakistan was that ideological state and we are the secular state who wants to assimilate all cultures, all religions, everything. So this too was part of that post-colonial marketing strategy that was carefully crafted by Nehru and Gandhi. But let's not discredit secularism for the sake of the fact that we are having this argument, because secularism held true a lot of things for the Indian domestic actors. And so long as it worked, it did work. But now it is that shrinking space that there is. I know that I'm eating up on my time, but moving further, I would also say that the ideological underpinnings, when we are looking at the strategic culture, are the ones that we look at that are viewed from Kautya's India, where Kautilya had a very strong realistic vision as to how India needs to look at its defense and foreign policy postures. And today we find the true implementation of the Arthashastra or Kautilyan doctrine, and that is where Pakistan feels the heat. That is where the region is changing from Modi Kautilya's mindset as to how India needs to work at it. The sacred is permeating India's secular identity. And here, India does not feel that its status is an earned entity. Rather, India feels that it is a given entity, and it is entitled to expand. It is entitled to be aggressive. It is entitled to show its hegemonic sentiments. So that is something which is extremely damaging when it comes to the future India. It is a Hinduon ka Hindustan, which is the popular sloganeering that is taking place. It is not a Hindustan which has the other nationalities in it. Mind it, when it says Hinduon ka Hindustan, that excludes everyone else. Hinduism is here being taken not as a cultural connotation, it is being taken as purely and purely a religio-cultural connotism. And for that, they are using the baggage of history, such as colonialism, the British defense legacy, what the Mughals had done, what the bad Muslims had done to them. The partition trauma is time and again played and overplayed. Children are made to do these tableaus where they're asked to down a mosque, which looks like a Babri masjid. The curriculum is changing overall, and that is creating a very, very narrow space for the Hindus and the Indians to exist technically. And very honestly, in the longer run, this is going to be far more damaging to India than otherwise. And all of these alliances that India is signing with various countries is also going to be counterproductive for India's alliance partners, because at one point India would become such an intolerant nation state or an intolerant polity. Actually, it would not any longer be a nation state in the terms of the democratic norms, but rather it would be a political entity which is totally going to be self-absorbing and self-damaging. And I would actually end my this particular discourse by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who was the author of Vande Mataram, the Indian anthem, which has replaced Iqbal Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara, which was the secular anthem that was played in schools at one time. And just see how this cultural connotation has totally changed, and how India has totally been frozen in time and culture. In one of Chatterjee's epic novel, Anandamath, which he wrote in 1882, he is talking about this final chapter, which is the peak of this epic battle that is taking place. And Satyananda, who is the hero of Chatterjee's Anandamath, has killed in the battle all the Muslim officers. So do keep in mind that we are talking about killing the elite, and very another aspect is that the Muslim soldiers have all fled, which is very humiliating. However, since the time is 1882, the British remained. And at that moment, Satyananda's master, he asked Satyananda to cease killing. To which Satyananda is very surprised and puzzled, and he asks him, which is Chatterjee, who's talking to him from behind the scene, as to why I should not kill the British, why I've just done half of the task. To which he replies, your task is accomplished. The Muslim power is destroyed. So this BJP RSS mindset was never about getting rid of any other aspect but Muslims from India, making the space intolerant for them, making the space non-habitual for them. And once that happens, what is going to happen? Either the Muslims of India are going to be killed, or the Muslims of India are going to be made to leave India. The situation is going to become that difficult for them that they would end up leaving the country. And where would they go? Either they would go to Bangladesh or they would come to Pakistan. Bangladesh is already feeling the heat in shape of Rohingya Muslims. And so what then actually would happen is that there would be an inflow of people from our eastern border as well. And if we look at the Afghan picture and we say that, oh, we have so many Afghan nationals coming to Pakistan, just imagine the type of pressure Pakistan would receive when it has people coming from the eastern quarters as well. So aspects such as the UCC, the NRC, the Citizenship Bill, Jammu and Kashmir revocation and its assimilation in the Indian body politics, and desecration of minority religious institutions are all part of a very well articulated and thought out strategy in which to make any and every religious minority religion feel suffocated and feel like leaving the country, but more so it is targeted against Muslims. And the Muslims of India always say one thing, that we fear and we face the strike of India's brutal might because of the creation of Pakistan. So the entire anger is vent out on us. So this is part of that larger 1947 partition trauma that RSS is willing to live and relive to define its moment. Thank you so much, Arish.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I agree with you that ideally, this is what the RSS mindset, the Sanghi mindset wants. Ideally, if they could decide, they would really want all the Muslims to reconvert back to either Hinduism or just to kick them out of India. But the main question here is how mainstream that thinking within India right now is. And I'm also thankful to you for bringing in this discussion of the conscious rewriting of narratives and history and Indian identity in India and how that's shaping India's internal politics. And thank you also for bringing up the conducive international environment that is being provided to India in the sense of the right-wing movements in other leading democracies of the world as well. So thank you so much, ma'am, for your comments. I have a few questions, but I would leave them to the Q&A session. Now I would like to invite our last speaker for today's session, Dr. ILHAN NIAZ, who is an associate professor in the Department of History at the Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. He is the author of various books, including an inquiry into the culture of power of the subcontinent, published in 2006 by Al-Hamra, The Culture of Power and Governance of Pakistan, 1947 to 2008, published in 2010 by Oxford University Press, Old World Empires, Cultures of Power and Governance in Eurasia, published in 2014 by Routledge, and The State During the British Raj, Imperial Governance in South Asia 1700 to 1947, published in 2019 by Oxford University Press. He has been teaching at the Quaid-e-Azam University since 2003. He is presently working on his next book, the title of which is New World Empires, Cultures of Power and Governance in the Americas, due out from Routledge in 2023 or 2024. His books on Pakistan and Eurasia have won the HEC Best Book Publication Awards in Social Sciences. With that introduction, I would request you, Dr. ILHAN NIAZ, to please give your remarks.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Before I get started, I'll have to make an admission in the sense that I am not an actual expert on Hindutva or India's contemporary politics. At the Quaid-e-Azam University, there are people better qualified than me to be here to speak on this topic, including Dr. Mujib Afzal, who has a brilliant book on the BJP and Indian Muslims, including a very enterprising and able young scholar of ours, Dr. Raja Kaisar Ahmed, whose new book is out from Macmillan on the domestic factor that Pakistan plays in the Indian political calculations and in the Indian party system. And we also have a brilliant young medieval historian here in our own department, Dr. Fawzia Farooq, who has written a fantastic history of India. It's called Muslim Rule in Medieval India, Religion and Politics during the Delhi Sultanate. So if you want to sort of understand what's going on in India today or in the past, there are definitely better people than me that you could invite. But with that caveat, I'll deliver what I hope will be a decent addition to today's discourse. Now, the first thing is that the domestic situation of any large country naturally has global implications. So when we think of India, we are talking about not just a country in the ordinary sense or even the medium-sized sense of the term. We are basically talking about a state that nearly encompasses a civilization, a state that nearly encompasses an entire subcontinent, and a state that represents a very significant portion of the entire human race. So anything that happens in India by way of its domestic political development, its economic development, its change in strategic priorities will naturally have implications not just for the region, but for the world at large. And this, of course, is exacerbated by ongoing trends such as globalization of trade and industries and commerce, which has the effect of making it hard to firewall the effects of what is happening in one place from what might be happening elsewhere. The second thing is that a few years ago, I had the privilege of being on a panel with Nurani Saab, whose brilliant new book you have highlighted. And he had written an earlier book as well called The RSS and BJP, A Division of Labor, which came out, I think, in 1999 or 2000. And we joked about, how it appears that rather than learning from Pakistan's mistakes, the Indians seem to be thinking that, let's us try to become a communal state and see how that works out for us. And I fear that for many moderate Pakistanis, for many modernist Pakistanis, the dread that we feel when we see India going down the path of communalism is partly because we have ourselves paid a dreadful price in terms of blood, in terms of treasure, in terms of lost opportunities for now more than 2 generations of Pakistanis, and also in terms of international reputation and social cohesion by walking down the path of communalism. I know that there is also a certain smugness with which we say that, well, this is why Jinnah created Pakistan. But I think when we do that, we perhaps fail to understand that the intention behind the creation of Pakistan was not so that the Muslims could set up an oppressive majoritarian communal state of their own, where they would do to their own minorities what unfortunately we see now the Indians have decided to do to theirs. So I think Muslim modernism and Muslim nationalism is in many ways different in terms of its original intent and its original ideological content from, unfortunately, what has happened in Pakistan since 1947. Now, be that as it may, When we think about the emergence in India of this new form of thinking, which is now becoming more and more politically potent, we need to perhaps try and empathize or try to walk briefly into how the adversary in this case, or our interlocutor, sees the world around them. So when you look at the reading of the past that we find in terms of the narrative of Hindu nationalism, there is an acute sense that since the end of the Gupta Empire, no Hindu state has successfully ruled over the whole of the Indian subcontinent. And not only has that old dream of a united Indian empire represented by the Mauryan Empire and then by the Gupta Empire failed to rematerialize in the form of a modern or medieval version of an Akhand Bharat, but India has been subjected to a long and continuing series of humiliations, whereby assorted outsiders belonging to different religions, different creeds, different worldviews, including the Afghans, the Turks, the Persians, the Mongols, etc., and of course, in modern times, the British, came in and ruled over the Indian subcontinent. And this sense of historical grievance is very, very profound in terms of the desire to reclaim not only the classical tradition of Indian statecraft and civilization as the Hindu nationalists see it, but to also see India on the world stage as a credible great power, as a power that is not afraid to assert itself. So if you look at the Hindu nationalist discourse, there is a sense that the nearly 1200 years of outside subjugation, as they see it, is an indicator that the Hindus had somehow lost their manliness, lost their courage, lost their self-respect. And so the Hindu cultural project, the Hindu political project is designed to restore dignity, as they see it, to a mass of people who have learned to cope with tremendous amounts of historical indignity and injustice. Now, unfortunately, of course, for the Muslim minority of India, that makes them, in a way, the residue, the demographic residue of a millennium of Islamic imperialism, as far as the Hindutva sees it. And the British have, of course, packed up and left, but the Muslims are too numerous and too widely spread in India to do any such thing. So that naturally makes the Muslim minority in India a target for the various projects, various types of cultural and political baiting that the Indian nationalist leaders, the Hindu nationalist leaders are engaged in. Now, the question then, of course, arises is that why doesn't the world care about this? One part of that answer is, of course, been provided by Dr. Salma, in the sense that there is a global trend towards the right-wing populism or nationalism. And so there is a growing acceptability, let us say, of this type of discourse or this type of leadership. But I would basically argue that the reason why the Western world or other important economic actors, including countries like, let's say, Japan or South Korea, etc., aren't particularly interested in the cultural or political implications of the Hindutva project is because of India's impressive economic clout. That fundamentally India, over the last 30 years, since its liberalization project began on the economic front in the early 1990s, has emerged as such an important trading and investment partner for so many different countries, such an important source of everything from raw materials to critical services to lucrative arms deals, that essentially silence whatever conscience the Western world or the developed East Asian countries might have about doing business with India. So while they might be prepared to make some noises now and then, and you can have a certain amount of hand wringing or a certain amount of shoulder shrugging that, oh, look, terrible things are happening. There is, I think, a general acceptance that it is not in the economic interest of the Western powers to disrupt their relationship with the Indian government, even if it chooses to pursue policies that are highly inimical to the continuity of India as a nominally liberal or a secular constitutional state. So this is something which I think Pakistanis themselves also need to realize, that there is no cavalry coming, that there's not going to be a sort of global coming together in order to fight Indian fascism. The other thing that perhaps you also need to understand is that the nature of Indian fascism is also in some ways different from the European fascism of the 1920s and 1930s. When we look at European fascism in the 1920s and 1930s, the two greatest examples of which are Mussolini and Hitler, in both cases, you have a very, very powerful movement built around a cult of personality. And that charismatic leader, in the case of the Nazis, Hitler, in the case of the Italian fascist Mussolini, simultaneously leads and embodies the movement. And that movement basically terminates when that leader is terminated to a large extent. In the context of Indian fascism, this movement has grown very slowly. It has grown over many, many generations. It has slowly expanded its demographic reach, its cultural appeal, and over a period of several generations, it has come to acquire the genuine loyalty and respect of a sizable number of the Indian population. Not a majority, of course, but a sizable plurality of the Indian electorate is genuinely adherent to the philosophy and the worldview represented by Hindutva. Now, what that means is that the Indian fascist leaders or the Indian fascist project is a gradualistic project. It is a project that is not operating on a strict time frame, unlike the Nazis or the Italian fascists. It is a program that is basically seeking to rewrite the cultural and political DNA of India's system. And it is prepared to wait. It is even prepared to retreat when necessary in order to preserve its strength. Now, a good example of this is that when we look at the recent agricultural protests in India, after trying to get the agricultural reforms through, the Indian government, led by Modi, of course, maybe taking a page out of our great leader, took a U-turn and decided that it was better to leave this for a later date. Another important factor here is that the Indian state machinery is extremely incompetent. So when it comes to the execution of the policies that the BJP government has in mind, they are more Colonel Klink than Albert Speer. They tend to mess things up quite badly. And we see this happening again and again in terms of many of the important reforms that the BJP has attempted to roll out. The currency reform in particular, the mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic are two glaring instances of sheer mismanagement on part of this leadership structure. So what we find basically is that we are dealing with a fascist project, but we are dealing with a slow burning fascist project. A fascist project that, unlike earlier fascist project, has a large institutional and demographic root, not enough to totally dominate Indian politics or Indian society, but enough to remain viable even if in the future it loses power at the federal level or at the provincial level to some sort of combined opposition, or simply due to its own failure to deliver on many of its promises. So I think we need to also appreciate that there are certain important differences in what is going on in India. Now, I'll conclude with what exactly can Pakistan do about this? Because obviously for Pakistan, the emergence of Hindu nationalism and the emergence of this kind of communal majoritarianism across the border has severe strategic implications, it has military implications, it has economic implications as well. It has implications in terms of our ability to normalize relations with India at some stage in the future as well. I think from the Pakistani perspective, we need to try and understand that our crying ourselves hoarse about what is going on in India has very little credibility because of what we have done in our own country to our own minorities, who are practically ghettoized and subject to various kinds of constitutional, legal, and social penalties. So if we are desiring to be taken seriously on human rights issues, we need to actually improve the human rights situation in our own country. And this, of course, is entirely within the power of the Pakistani state and society to do. If we actually make Pakistan a more genuinely tolerant and open society, in contrast to the Indian trajectory of narrowing down and darkening and communalism, then perhaps we will have greater credibility in the longer term when we criticize India for doing things which in many ways Pakistan has already done to its minorities. So I think we need to realize that when we are pointing one finger at the Indians, the remaining fingers remain pointed at us. And unfortunately, when we look in the mirror, it is not a very pleasing sight. So that is one note of caution, I think, that many Pakistani analysts tend to forget when they go off on a tangent about what is happening in India. That let us cultivate our own garden, as Voltaire said. Let us make our country a credible alternative of South Asian modernity. And then, of course, we can castigate the Indians, day and night for their decision to walk down what is going to be a very, very dangerous path, not only for them, but for the entire region. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. NIAZ. You talked about some of the Pakistanis who draw parallels between what happened in Pakistan in the 1980s and what's going on in India right now. I remember in 2004, Mani Shankar Iyer, who later on became a minister in the Congress government as well. He came to Pakistan to attend one of our seminars. And in that seminar, he made a very pertinent remark about what happened in Pakistan in the 1980s. He said that Islam had united Pakistan, but Islamization had divided it. So maybe more or less the same can be said about India as well. But I would now come to the questions. I have a few questions of my own as well, but I can see a couple of questions from Imran Sardar in the chat panel. So a couple of good questions. He is asking first, how long the Hindutva ideology is going to work for the BJP to maximize its political gains? Like, has it already run its course, or there is still some steam in it? And secondly, how long will it take for the liberal class to give RSS a severe blow? Which means that how resilient is the educated and liberal class in India to withstand the Hindutva onslaught? I would direct this question to Ilhan Yasa first, and then the other two panelists can also respond.
Well, I think that fundamentally, Hindutva, the BJP, its core ideology and values now represent a pretty stable 20 to 25% of the electoral base of India. And depending upon the particular circumstances and the particular province we are talking about, that can be extended to between 30 to 35, 40%, etc. One of the things that we need to remember is that in a multi-party democratic system, you don't actually need an outright majority in order to form the government. So when we look at, let's say, the rise of German fascism, at no stage in their rise to power did the Nazis really command seriously more than a third of the electorate's support. And in a similar manner, when we look at India under the Indian National Congress, I think the maximum electorate support that the Indian National Congress ever managed to get was 46 or 48%. So they never actually managed to get a majority of the vote, though of course they formed the majority of the governments for practically the whole of the first 50 years of India's history. So I think from the BJP's perspective, 20% is good. And if they want to match the Congress in terms of establishing a situation where they will become a dominant party, they need to get to roughly around between 35 to 42, 43% of the electorate. And getting there is perhaps the challenge that is before them, that how exactly should they get there? One view is that, you know, the way to get there is to double down on the original ideology and program and go more hardline. And the other view is that, you know, the way to actually get more people on board is to be a bit more pragmatic, a bit more open, a bit more accommodating, and sort of win over as many independents or neutrals or smaller parties or groups as you can in order to cobble together a functioning large stable majority. So, but these are like different approaches and they are not mutually exclusive. So you can do it like, you know, you can double down on the hardline approach, let us say in UP, and you can also try to have some sort of political accommodation in the south of India, where the BJP has a tougher electoral map to face. So these are not mutually exclusive. But I think that it is now a reality of Indian politics that the BJP has a stable vote bank that it can increase in order to establish governing coalitions or majorities in most of the country, especially at the federal level. Regarding the liberal opposition, I think that in many ways, the liberal opposition has created the ideal structural conditions for the rise of the BJP. When we look at India, there is a very good study of inequality in India called From British Raj to Billionaire Raj by Thomas Piketty. And one of the points that he notes is that during the first 40 years of Indian independence, the redistributive policies of the Indian National Congress, while they did not produce high levels of economic growth, they actually caused a dramatic decrease in the level of socioeconomic inequality in India. Whereas since 1990, India has not only returned to colonial levels of inequality, but it has now exceeded those levels quite considerably. The result of this is that the billionaires, as it were, the wealthy plutocrats of Indian society, they are in a position to put their assets at the disposal of any anti-democratic force, at any strong man who can promise them stability. And the BJP generally now gets a lot more donations from Indian big businesses than the Indian National Congress. So I would basically say that the liberal elite in India, under Manmohan Singh when he was finance minister, and then continuing on when he was the prime minister, they have in a way undercut the foundation. Because the problem here is this: if the Indian National Congress is pushing neoliberal policies that benefit the wealthy few and has abandoned its traditional social program of redistribution and reform, and the BJP is doing the same thing, then it is a battle between cultural appeal, not substantive policy. And when it comes to cultural appeal, the cultural appeal of Hindutva is far more potent than the cultural appeal of, Nehruvian constitutionalist ideals, or, telling Indians about, how brilliant Montesquieu's theory of separation of powers was. So I think on that score, what the Congress has done is that it has removed the economic substance from politics and left politics basically a field for culture wars. And this is what has happened not only in India, but it has happened in the West as well, because the new left in England and the new left in United States are, Bill Clinton, etc. Essentially, they abandoned what made them social democrats. And having abandoned what made them social democrats, they basically set the stage for the triumph of right-wing identitarian politics. Because when it comes to culture, you can't really beat conservatives brandishing religion, certainly not in our part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. There are assembly elections coming up in UP, Uttar Pradesh, and Uttarakhand next month. So I think it would be a good litmus test for whether this Hindutva politics, as you said, has run its course or not politically. Ma'am Salma Malik had told me yesterday that she has a meeting to attend at 12, so I don't know whether she has to leave or not. Would you like to also comment on the question?
Thank you so much, Arish. Yes, I have been on the side holding the meeting. Thank you very much. In fact, Dr. Ilhan has pinpointed exactly the main things that affect this moment where we see that there might be a change, or there's space for the liberals, or resilience left in the liberals. I would totally agree with what he has flagged here. When you concede the space to ideologues, and when you concede this situation where you are not actually bringing forth an alternate viewpoint or a strong viewpoint, then the ideological or the ideologues would definitely claim this particular space. And the point that we, both Ilhan and I, have made in our presentation as well, is that Pakistan has also gone through this course of extremist mindset, the ideological politics, and it has a strong appeal with the masses. And also mind one thing, that South Asia is a very oral culture. We don't look into the depth of issues. We just go by what the clergy, the mullah, or the prohat, or whosoever, the man with whom we have the direct contact, the first point of contact at the religious spaces, says to us, and we are willing to believe that. We are not a people who are deeply wedded into philosophy and theology and all of those aspects. We are very much into religiosity. And anyone who comes and tells us that this is what Allah or Ram or Sita have said, actually Sita doesn't have too much of a space in it, it's not a very feminist religion. But what Shiv has said, or any of these gods of destruction and anger have said, people are willing to believe it. And people are more than willing to not only believe it, they're willing to buy it, and they're willing to practice it. Having said that, the other aspect is that whether it be Congress or any of those secular democratic spaces, they haven't really evolved with time. They remain in a time wrap. They haven't done much to counter this wave of religious extremism. Were they able to actually transform themselves into a wave of future? That's a big question. To date, Congress is only and only a very dynastic rule in which the Nehru-Gandhi family's name still sells. And this is a tragedy of South Asian politics. And that is why we are seeing that despite the fact that these parties still remain very much wedded to the icons of political dynasty, those icons of political dynasty don't have much to offer to the people. They have the same repetitive stuff, and the political legitimacy of these parties is lessening with time. Another very important point that ILHAN flagged here was the mercantile mindset, the economy that is being marketed by BJP, despite the fact that shiny India and the enchanted India and all of those slogans are being nullified time and again, yet still the very fact is that again, the secular political leadership has not been able to bring forth a very strong and viable blueprint for economy or economic sustenance of future India. And India is a country with growing needs. And religion is an opiate that people are more than willing to take when it comes to despondency, when it comes to poverty. If people are dying by the dozens because of COVID, it is happening because we are bad with our religion. So, there are a lot of valid excuses for people with lesser education and awareness to buy into. Has this hard mindset run its course? No, I don't think so. So long as it does not have a very strong, viable alternative to counter it and defeat it, this particular mindset is going to prevail. And at least for another 10 years, it is going to be there. And even if it is not there, it has done sufficient damage to the body politics of India. And it is going to, and it has become institutionalized. And now that it has become institutionalized, it is going to stay, even if it weakens in terms of the political tentacles that we see at the moment. Thank you, Arish.
Thank you, Dr. Salma Malik. Asma, I would like to ask you another question, just to move on a bit. You mentioned in your remarks that Hindutva was very much there before the creation of Pakistan, and actually the creation of Pakistan was partly a result of this Hindutva ideology among the Hindus. But many in India would argue that Hindutva was not a mainstream ideology in India until the turn of the century. So how would you respond to that? Asma, are you there?
I think she left, or maybe have some issue.
Okay, so Dr. Salma Malik, would you like to respond to this?
Sorry, you mentioned that
that she said
Hindutva
that
was very much a power prior to the creation of the state of India.
Yeah, but some in India would argue that Hindutva was not mainstream in politics. Like, they won the election in 1990, and they started winning limited number of seats in the 1980s. But it only became a mainstream phenomenon at the turn of the century and after the turn of the century, actually in the 21st century. So would you agree with this contention?
I totally agree with this. In terms of having that political vote base, it became a mainstream phenomenon much later, at the turn of the century. However, the very fact that the Hindutva mindset not only existed, it was very much there. And the first damage to the secular tenets of India were done by this Hindutva mindset in the killing of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. So one cannot say that this is a development that happened way later when Congress was not delivering on its secular ideals. This mindset prevailed. The Maharashtrian movement, the Maratha movement, and all are wedded into this entire debate. But yet, in terms of the vote power and having it had, mind you, it had the street power in certain areas, and a better political scientist can explain these terminologies in a more nuanced fashion. But I would actually say that we need to figure out that the ideological clout, the street power, this RSS BJP brigade had even prior to the creation of the state of India and to the state of Pakistan. And again, I repeat, Nathuram Godse did not happen just because 1947 happened. There were several Nathuram Godses who existed in the peripheries and they garnered support. And just imagine the type of fan following he received once he did what he did. And how much people, and now the type of ideal worshipping that is being done in India. There's this huge statue of Godse being made, and people are garlanding them and all. And these actually show that the appetite for hard mindset is increasing by the day. And this is a very, very alarming sentiment. And we see parallels happening in our society just as much, which the point that Dr. ILHAN alluded to, and which is very true. And I think when we look at India and we see how damaging, because we are giving a very impartial third-party analysis, we need to then realize that what such extremist mindset over the decades can do to the life and health of a very, very healthy state. Thank you.
You had also mentioned in your remarks about the conducive international environment that is provided to India, like for instance, with regard to the democratic dispensations in other countries and the direction that they are going in. What, in your opinion, does that tell us about democracy itself? Like, why is democracy today propelling such people with such extremist mindsets to power? Like, is there a need for a rethink in democracy as well?
There is this particular notion of saying that, oh, there is this Indian democracy and there's this American democracy, large democracies and small democracies. The very fact is that no system is an ideal system. It is a representative system at best, and it can remain an ideal system so long as it is providing a safe, healthy political as well as social environment to all of the people in that political polity. But here we see that India, the largest democracy, as it is touted, is turning on its head. And then we see the oldest democracy, the USA under Trump, undertaking a totally different trajectory. And the very fact that Joe Biden has returned doesn't really change the Trump mindset in India, in the US. And that is something that we really need to think of. I think this is a moment where the international political pundits need to sit down and rethink that what went wrong with the project democracy. Voice towards non-participation, non-inclusivity, that is becoming part and parcel of this democratic norm. That is becoming part and parcel of the fact that people want this time of and this time of self-realization where I am I and I don't give space to you to also claim who you are is damaging the very edifice of what we term as democracy. But democracy has these inherent flaws in it. It has the space for voicing opinion. And when some opinions are not voiced, but they're shouted upon, then the other opinions become muted. Inclusivity is chucked out of the window. So I think this is a high time that we need to actually reevaluate where this moment of democracy went wrong. And Francis Fukuyama's factor, the democracy is the end all political projects that one can see of actually then tells you that even if you have democracy happening worldwide, there are going to be certain socio-political dynamics and factors which are going to act as spoilers and which are going to make people contest the basic social fault.
Thank you. Since Asma has rejoined, Asma, thank you for rejoining. You mentioned in your comments that there is Kurukshetra taking place in India at home, and there is no chance for peaceful coexistence of India with its neighbors. What would you tell people who would want to disagree with this on the very fact that India has been trying to pursue peaceful diplomatic relations with all its neighbors, and that things are not as bad in India?
I think she's facing some technical issues.
Okay. So I'll move then to ILHAN Saab. You had I would also like you to shed some light on this democracy point that I raised in front of Dr. Salma Malik earlier. And also you mentioned in your talk that the international community wants to do business with India, so that's why it has to turn a blind eye to what's going on inside India. What does this tell us about the future of the international order, the liberal international order that is espoused by the leader of the free world, the United States, and what does it tell us about the future of the free world?
When it comes to democracy, the way, of course, we would understand democracy today would be in the sense of a liberal democracy. And in a liberal democracy, you, of course, have majority rule, but you also have restraints on that majority in terms of what it can do to people who are in a minority. So if we look at, for example, the United States Constitution, amending that Constitution is extremely difficult. It requires not only a 2/3 majority in the central assemblies, it also requires 2/3 of the states to then ratify any constitutional amendment. Then you have the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is an unelected body, of course. It is constituted for lifetime of its members, and it exercises the power of judicial review. And it can strike down any law that it deems to be repugnant to the basic principles of the American Constitution or the American Republic. And then, of course, you have a host of other organizations and bodies at the local level, at the regional level, including different circuits of the judiciary, different layers of the federal and the local authorities. And each of these are constituted separately from each other. So you can very often end up in a situation where, let's say, the governor of a state is a Republican, but the mayors of most of the big cities are Democrats, and the senators are gridlocked because there's like 50-50 on both sides. So I think when we think about democracy, one of the big challenges that democratic constitutions faced is, how do you restrain the majority from behaving in a manner that is incompatible with the survival or with the dignity of large parts of the population that may not be able to secure representation in sufficient numbers? This was also, interestingly, a very important part of the colonial era debate between the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress. That essentially the question between the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League was that the Muslim League believed that in South Asia, the political culture is of a communal nature. And as a consequence, we need a system where minorities are overrepresented relative to their numbers in order to ensure that a majority does not ride roughshod over their interests or their rights. Whereas the Indian National Congress was of the view that all Indians are Indians, and essentially it should just be one person, one vote, and there is no need for any special safeguards for any particular minority based upon this. They, in fact, accused those holding this point of view of sort of advancing the British design of divide and rule. So this debate about majoritarianism, the limits to majoritarianism, how to manage it, is something which has existed in all democracies. Now, in the context of India, what we have seen is that the institutional safeguards, the guardrails, let us say, of the Indian Constitution, particularly the Supreme Court of India, has over the last several years practically abdicated its role as a braking mechanism on what the Hindu nationalists want to do. We see this in the Ayodhya judgment. We see this in the failure to take action with reference to the de facto amendment carried out to the Indian Constitution by the BJP with regard to the annexation of Kashmir. We also see this with reference to the clean chit that the Supreme Court gave Modi with reference to his role in the Gujarat massacres, in which he was obviously involved by any reasonable standard. So I think what we see in India is that the institutional mechanisms put in place by the architects of India's first republic to potentially or actually restrain a majority from acting in a manner that is illiberal and inconducive to the human rights or the dignity of minorities, those guardrails are not functioning. And in that context, what we might likely see is that India will continue to be a democracy in the sense that, you know, there will be elections and there will be prime ministers and chief ministers and assemblies and everything. But those elections might start to return an increasingly majoritarian verdict, unrestrained by liberal norms, unrestrained by judicial review, unrestrained by the even basic principles upon which politics had hitherto been carried out in India. So I think that is something which every democracy faces, that on the one hand, of course, there is an external risk to a democracy that, you know, of a popular revolution or a military coup or that sort of thing. But there is also an inbuilt risk that what happens if that democracy degenerates into a kind of angry and resentful majoritarianism that seeks to use the cloak of democracy to inflict great harm upon people that it deems to be ideologically or racially undesirable. And this is something which we see happening all over the world, and we have seen happen in different mature democracies as well. So if we look at the United States and you look at the American South after the Reconstruction era, the so-called Jim Crow era, what you actually see is a kind of white supremacist democracy taking hold in large parts of the United States that then uses majoritarian power to suppress the African Americans who have been recently emancipated from slavery. So this is a basic problem that we have. When it comes to the world doing business with India, well, look, India is doing business with everyone. You know, look at India's trade with China. Though the two countries might be political or military rivals, they are economic friends. Look at India's business with the United States. Look at the tremendously high profile that Indian CEOs, technical entrepreneurs, etc., enjoy in the centers of the global capitalist economy. So I think that in that sense, the Indian elite, the Indian capitalist class, is sufficiently globalized, sufficiently integrated into the networks of global capital accumulation that there is very little chance that serious economic sanctions or restrictions will be brought to bear against India, even if it decides to pursue a far more violent approach towards dealing with its minorities than it has done till this point in time. Look at Narendra Modi. I mean, he was banned from entering the United States because of his role in the Gujarat massacre. After he, becomes the prime minister, well, then, they're organizing Howdy Modi events for him in Texas. So what's the problem? Thank you.
Some food for thought for us right there. I have one last question for you, Ilhan Saab. You talked about our moral standing with regard to talking about minority rights in India when we are not safeguarding minority rights as desirably as one should. But do you really think that the situation of minorities in Pakistan is as bad as it is in India, or do you have some other suggestions for us?
Acha, dekhein, a lot depends upon what indicators you use. So, for example, in Pakistan, you cannot get your identity papers made without signing a form that specifically declares a section of your fellow citizens to be non-Muslims. I have a passport and a national identity card, so I've ticked that form. I'm sure you have as well, and many others have as well. In Pakistan, literally every day, Hindu girls are abducted, they are raped, they are forcibly converted to Islam when their families try to retrieve them. And the Sindh government and other authorities simply look the other way. With the rise of the TLP, you have an even more significant social menace emerging in Pakistan. Then our mainstream discourse, our Prime Minister is creating a Rahmatul Alameen authority located in the Prime Minister's office. You have the whole fiasco over the religious content of textbooks, which is an old fiasco, but under the SNC, it has come back with a vengeance. And you have all sorts of other indicators that would basically show that Pakistani minorities, whether they are Christians or whether they are Hindus or whether they are Ahmadis, are highly ghettoized. They are essentially there on the sufferance of the majority. And they can be liquidated essentially at will with very little consequence to those that will do that liquidation. So I think that when it comes to our own tragic trajectory with reference to non-Muslim minorities, but also when we look at minority sects, such as what has happened in terms of Shia-Sunni relations in Pakistan over the last 30, 40 years, that actually paints a very, very disheartening picture. So, when I come to the university every morning, outside the university, there is an illegally built structure. And that illegally built structure has a giant picture of Khadim Hussain Rizvi on it. So it's a friendly reminder about where perhaps the power in our republic increasingly lies. So I think that we have to be very, very careful when we frame our analysis. And any honest analysis of, from Pakistan, which is about India, must basically begin from this premise that, look, what we have done to ourselves, we do not wish on our worst enemy. And the consequences of a country the size of India walking down this path are simply so dreadful for the future of humanity at large that everybody actually needs to get together to try and stop the march of Indian fascism. That, maybe, the world can maybe live with, a crackpot Pakistan or a crackpot Iran, but the world will have a very hard time if, you have this sort of situation in India. And that is something which is a very hard sell in Western capitals because of India's immense economic clout. So, they don't basically they are looking at their short to medium term economic interest. They are not thinking about the long-term implications for global order, in which a major world power becomes some version of fascism in the 21st century. So that is something which I'm afraid is something which for Pakistanis at least is a very hard sell, partly because it's too easy to throw back whatever our criticism of India is in our faces by virtue of what we've been doing to our minorities over the last 30, 40 years. Thank you.
That very well sums up or concludes today's discussion. Mixing religious extremism with politics is bad in any form. And when such religious extremism is able to sway a majority in any country, it's even worse. I agree with you on this one. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for this very, very informative session. Thank you, ILHAN Saab. Thank you, Salma Malik. Thank you, everyone else. It has been really, really informative and educative. Thank you, everybody, and Allah Hafiz.